Father Rush, family and friends. In a sense, I've been preparing for today all my life. For from a very early age, about the time our mother was reading Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie to Lehene and me, she told us, whatever you do when you grow up, don't put me in a home and don't burn me. I'm not sure I really understood, and nor did she, being only in her 20s. But later, as we grew older, she added, and when I die, you must be there holding my hand. As it turned out, our mother herself broke the first two rules. In 2008, when I flew over from Melbourne to Hobart for the 60th anniversary party of Old Nick Company, I telephoned Father Rush and asked for a grave for my mother. He said that was impossible, but he offered a place in the ashes urn. And I telephoned my mother in Melbourne, and only most reluctantly did she agree. But she agreed, and only later would a grave become possible. Next day, a Sunday, on my way back to Melbourne, I called from the airport again. She didn't answer. A voice came, a man's voice. Peter from Body Corporate. The ambulance is just taking your mother to hospital. She's had a heart attack. That heart attack necessitated a double bypass. And the double bypass caused a major stroke. Dorothy had to learn to walk again, to speak again, to write again, to learn to use cutlery. Then, after mastering all that, 5 years later, in the dead of night, she fell and had another major stroke, a hemorrhagic stroke, bleeding in the brain. Now, in this prolonged, painful period of recovery, she was assessed and told that she could no longer risk living independently because of her high risk of falling. So at age 88, Dorothy was admitted into aged care. And not once in the 7 years that followed did she demand, get me out of here, or I can come and live with you. No, she accepted her physical limitations and realized that I alone could never be available 24 hours, 7 days a week, let alone lift her up from the floor when she fell. The second daughter of Chinese-born tin miner and fruit merchant Jin Jung Henry and his wife, the Sydney-born Chinese-raised Mary Lam Lee, Dorothy was born on the 14th day of the 4th month, 1925, at 152 Elizabeth Street, a laundry and fancy goods store on the corner of Brisbane Street, where the workers from the timber mill Crisp and Gun fired the Henry family business with roaring sales of cigarettes, tobacco, and matches. Within 2 years, Dorothy moved across the road to 153 Elizabeth Street because her father wished to help out his brother who wanted to return to China. So grandfather bought out his business and converted it into a two-department store. One side selling fruit and vegetables, the other side fancy goods, including leather purses and pouches, fireworks, pen knives, and Pear's soap, and the beautifully perfumed soaps of Roger and Gallet. Now that childhood aroma of Roger and Gallet lingered lifelong for Dorothy. She never used mothballs in the wardrobe. She always used Roger and Gallet. At 153 Elizabeth Street, which is now a Utah's student housing complex, Dorothy developed rickets. She had been reared only on rice water, with never a drop of milk. And now she was forced into leg irons, which made her walk on the sides of her feet for the next 3 years. And in later life, her weak lower limbs would contribute to frequent falls. And rickets meant that Dorothy was determined that Lehene and I would have strong bones. So 5 Bunnikins mugs of milk a day were routine. In 1931, 5-year-old leg iron Dorothy made her first overseas adventure. That was to China, when her father made his 5th return visit, taking the whole family. And on the boat she discovered the piano. It mesmerized her. She loved it so much she pestered her father until eventually he bought her a violin back in Hobart. And she passed her love of music on to Lehene and me, especially Lehene. In Toishan, the ancestral county southwest of the Guangdong province Canton, grandfather built his dream home. And when his mother saw what he'd built, the 3 stories with the interlocking staircases and with the central atrium featuring the main ancestral shrine, she was overcome with pride. Now that I've seen what you've achieved, I can go and join your father in the afterlife. Little Dorothy went with her father to the capital, Canton, a 2-day trek from the village, by road, by sedan chair, by boat, with an overnight stay in the Pearl River Delta. She gripped her father's hand, and in her pocket she carried a piece of paper with her Chinese name, Clear Moon, and her Canton address written in Chinese characters. Crowded Canton then abounded with beggars, criminals, and would-be kidnappers. One scene she never forgot was the sight of a rickshaw man eating his lunch, a bowl of rice with a single, very thin slice of pork sausage. He shoveled the rice with chopsticks into his mouth, ate it, then picked up the slice of sausage, rested it in his mouth, savored it, placed it back on the rice, and as Dorothy told me, he made that one thin slice of sausage last the whole bowl of rice. At some stage, she went briefly to a Cantonese kindergarten where she learned a nursery rhyme. And 90 years later, out of the blue, she suddenly remembered it and sang it in Cantonese to me about the hoot, hoot, hoot of a train. One significance of that 1930s trip to China was the conversion to Catholicism by Dorothy's big sister, Joyce. Joyce, as the firstborn and a girl, and later Dorothy, suffered severely by their mother's ignorant, traditional prejudice against girls as worthless. As Joyce told me, my mother didn't love me, so I found Christ's love. The family returned to Hobart via Brisbane at the end of 1934. Henry & Co. reopened at 139 Liverpool Street, and Dorothy, aged 9, with very little English and only a few months schooling in Brisbane, enrolled at St Columba's. A disagreement with Sister Malachi had her walking out to Elizabeth Street State School. Oh, what a shock. No more flowers in the classroom. No more smiling, "Good morning, children." No. At Elizabeth Street State School, she was taunted with "Ching Chong Chinaman," until she challenged her worst offender. "You call me names once more and you'll be sorry. I'll use my martial arts, my black belt." A fight declared. The school gathered around, and Dorothy gave a swift one to the chest of her bully and readied for the return. It didn't come. Bluff had won. After that, she was only called names behind her back. When the principal reprimanded her, she declared, "One day the dragon will come to Australia." Indeed, and now breathing fire worldwide. Each morning on the way to school, Dorothy carried a bucket to feed the chooks at the rear of their former store in Elizabeth Street. After school, she cleaned the pen, picked up a chook, carried it home, thrashing about in a hessian bag, helped her mother kill the bird and cook it in a pot over the fire for dinner. In between serving customers in the shop, she cleared a bit of space for her homework. Dorothy wanted to be at Elizabeth Street High in order to go on to Commercial High to learn shorthand and bookkeeping to help her father in the business. Her mother had no time for Dorothy. She stopped her violin lessons. "You're only a girl, worthless, a waste of money, only fit to work in the shop. I should have put you in a bucket and drowned you at birth." Her father tried to compensate. He bought her a brand new Malvern Star bicycle, which she rode all the way to Commercial High at Moona. But at 15, her beloved father died. She was devastated. She helped her mother dress him in his best suit and placed crisp £1 notes into his pockets, the wherewithal for the afterlife. Joyce, who had been working non-stop in the shop, now flew to Brisbane and married. Joyce had been like a mother to Dorothy, and she felt bereft. She flew for refuge to her family friend, Mabel Wong, in Melbourne, and there she had a mental breakdown. She screamed out in the dead of night. A doctor was called, and Dorothy couldn't remember who she was. She couldn't even remember her own name. Back in Hobart, her mother didn't berate her as much. The law of life gradually lifted Dorothy upwards. The Mercury named her Miss China 1942, busily helping the Allied cause in the Second World War in a big fair at the Hobart Town Hall. Her brothers, Gordon and Lester, introduced her to their handsome friend, Charles Chung. She was charmed. The pair married, and Charles's father set them up in a new business which they launched, W. Chung Sing & Co. at 99 Liverpool Street, just down the road from Henry & Co. Lehene was born, followed by me. But the marriage proved rocky, and Dorothy returned to her mother, who so adored Lehene she could do no wrong. If Lehene picked up an egg and let it fall to the floor, Grandmother exclaimed, "Oh, isn't she clever?" Grandma spoiled Lehene and me and spared no expense in the finest of baby wear. Declared Grandmother, "The girls shall be brought up as Henrys." But when Grandmother went to join her husband at Cornelian Bay, no such provision was made in the will, and Dorothy was left without means. Despite goodwill on her brother's part, despite her cooking the family meals in the shop, despite her serving in the shop, her hairdressing, and her modelling for artists, Dorothy brought Lehene and me up without ever a guaranteed income. And Lehene and I would never forget the family rows we witnessed over who would pay our bills. Our mother tried to instill upon us, be independent, get an education, don't be like me, having to ask for money, only fit to work in a shop. Now Dorothy, too old to be apprenticed in Hobart, enrolled in hairdressing in Sydney. And she took the advice of the Hobart artist, Eileen Brooker, who today has honoured us at the age of 99 by making the enormous effort to join us here today. Eileen Brooker, who we will see later in her more sprightly years at the Artists' Ball of 1951, Eileen Brooker had met Dorothy in the shop and asked to draw her. She now suggested to Dorothy that she support herself in Sydney while studying hairdressing by being an artist's model. Sydney introduced Dorothy to a new bohemian world of art, books, and ideas. She sat through late-night coffee conversations that were above her head, but a little was absorbed by Dorothy, and she filtered that through to Lehene and me. So although our mother had less than 6 years' schooling, she brought us up over the shop in a rich cultural milieu with strains of the violin, the wireless tune to classical music, tomato boxes filled with penguin paperbacks, prints of Miro and Picasso on the wall, and children's versions of Chaucer and Shakespeare among our earliest books. In 1954, we moved from the shop to a rented house in Newtown with New Zealand-born Sydney radio announcer Rex Walden. And one day on the tram, Dorothy found herself talking to a St. Peter's schoolboy. He had such a lovely face, but he looked neglected, so she whipped him back into town and bought him a new school uniform. Next morning, he turned up at the front door with his father. I didn't believe him, so I belted him for stealing. After that, Kevin used to let himself in the morning and make himself breakfast on the way to school. An example of Dorothy's not necessarily wise penchant for spontaneous generosity. She bought a red MG to carry the parcels home. Actually, Uncle Lester bought it, and she paid him back weekly. And at the same time, she adopted an unwanted German shepherd, Raja, the first of a series of shepherds. Then, on her 33rd birthday, she told Lehene and me to get in the MG, and she drove us down to Longley, where she rented the former Devonshire tea rooms of former founding director of Tasmanian education, Leslie Greener, adult education, Leslie Greener, an Egyptologist. And soon the path from the cottage where 58-year-old Leslie lived with his son Guy, through the lupin field to the tenant's house, became worn, and the two families became one. And then Rex joined Longley with his half Maori son Peter, who spruced up the coachman's cottage, a blended multicultural family decades ahead of its time. The death of Rex in 1966 prompted Dorothy's move to 3 Lambert Avenue, Sandy Bay, where she lived for the next 33 years. From there, she worked for Uncle Lester at Fruity Tooty to cover the cost of my university books. She cultivated camellias, and she won successive prizes for her immaculately maintained Jaguar Bronze Mark II. She sometimes travelled with Leslie to Egypt, and she always accompanied Leslie to the numerous exhibitions he opened in and around Hobart, from Don Camillo in Magnet Court to Alice Crongart's Sadler's Court here in Richmond. Dorothy and Leslie loved Richmond, and they intended to settle here. But that was put to rest by Leslie's demise in December 1974. In 1997, Dorothy was thrilled by Lehene's reunion with her son, Graham, who had been adopted and raised interstate. When Lehene became ill in 1998 and again in 2000, Dorothy made her last 2 trips to London. And when Lehene died very late on New Year's Day 2001, Mama knelt by her bed, prayed for her soul until the new winter's white dawn. This religious bent had intensified after Dorothy's move to Melbourne in 1999. The bad Catholic mother, whom I knew to have only gone to Mass twice in my life, my first communion and Uncle Gordon's funeral in 1995, now went daily to the packed church in Lonsdale Street, St. Francis Church. And she always had a Mass celebrated on the anniversary of Lehene's death. And even after her last major fall, just before Christmas 2019, a fall that broke her collarbone and confined her to a wheelchair, Mama insisted on going to Lehene's Mass on New Year's Day 2020, her last New Year's Day. Throughout her very long life, Dorothy read widely on philosophy and different religious systems, beginning with Krishnamurti in her 20s. At Lambert Avenue, she had hanging in the hallway a portrait of the controversial Indian guru Sai Baba. But in the bedroom, at the same time, candles burnt before statues of Our Lady. As my partner John said, having a bob each way. In Melbourne, she went to the Theosophical Society, joined the Spiritualist Society, and subscribed to the UK spiritist journal Two Worlds. And even in her final months, when macular degeneration made reading near impossible, she insisted on keeping the 3 well-bookmarked volumes of Bertrand Russell's autobiography on her desk. No, I don't want you to take them away. Keep them there. The last book that totally absorbed Dorothy was Antonia Fraser's Must You Go? My Life with Harold Pinter. She wrote down its final words onto paper and showed me, you must read this. I leant over and felt no breath. He was white and dead. I sat for a while. Then I kissed him. His dear body was already quite cool. Must you go? Yes, it was time. Before I left, and after another final kiss, I said, good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels wing thee to thy rest.